Section 7 is part 2 of the pair of sections we dedicated to explaining the fee structure around import drayage services. As we go through this second section on fee structures, you'll see why we split it up, because it becomes pretty complex. The first one we'll talk about in Section 7 is referred to as a pre-pull. A pretty long definition, but important to understand. A pre-pull is a situation where an importer has a container drayed off of a terminal and held at the drayage operator's yard prior to giving delivery instructions. Depending on the agreement with the drayage operator, there may or may not be a charge for this service. Essentially, as we see parenthetically, temporary container storage at the drayage yard. Pre-pulls are used for a couple different reasons, but as we see wrapping up this definition, pre-pulls are sometimes used by importers when demurrage free time is running out and they need to get containers off of the terminal, or when the importer isn't sure about the final destination of the container. A pre-pull always involves grabbing a container off of a terminal, but having it temporarily stored somewhere before it gets delivered to its final destination. That somewhere is almost always the drayage operator's yard or a third-party yard that the drayage operator makes arrangements to use. The key about a pre-pull is that it's not coming off the terminal and going to where it needs to be delivered to ultimately. Pre-pulls are used to avoid demurrage, as we see, and also sometimes in a scenario where an importer needs to decide quickly what they're going to do with a container, but need to get it off the terminal while they're deciding that factor. Usually a pre-pull is an overnight affair. It might be a day, a little bit more, but pre-pulls should be done quickly. A couple of others that become interesting, especially in our first one, where terminals operate what are referred to as a night gate, the ability to pick up fulls or drop off empties at nighttime. These days, and it will depend upon the port and the terminal, but when containers are pulled off of a terminal at night, the cost is usually higher because of the driver shortage and potentially hours of service requirements. Drayage operators have to pay the driver more to pull at night. This night pull charge, as it's called, is in addition to the base drayage rate and covers the extra expense of recovering containers during non-daytime hours. We as importers, certainly as 3PLs organizing drayage operations and as dray people directly, every port that we operate in, we have to know if there are night gates, night hours, essentially, and what are the costs associated with a night pull. Our second bullet on this slide is pretty important. It's called wait time. Typically, the base charge for drayage assumes a certain amount of time needed to recover a container from a terminal. Beyond that, as we see in our second sentence, if the driver has to wait beyond the allotted appointment time, an additional hourly fee is charged for the amount of additional time lost waiting. In big ports that experience congestion, in smaller ports that experience congestion, wait time can be a big deal. Depending on the port, New York, New Jersey, maybe in Norfolk, certainly in LA Long Beach, perhaps a Houston, wait time becomes a big deal because time is money, as the saying goes. And if drayage people can't get onto a terminal and pull a box within 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours, the clock starts ticking. And there's an hourly fee when that driver has to wait. Because if they're not waiting, they're not hauling. Be sure, especially as a BCO, to understand the implications of wait time at specific ports and what the charges are associated with wait time. Another delightful scenario in the world of drayage is what's referred to as an attempt, and this is a fee that is charged by the drayman when a pickup, especially for an appointment, is not honored by the terminal, or an attempt is made to pick up a container and that container isn't ready. Attempts can go awry on terminals where appointments are required, and even when appointments aren't required. In this day and age, it's not unusual for a trucker to show up at a gate and attempt to make a pickup and be told container isn't ready. Or it's buried under 3 other containers and it won't be ready until tomorrow. Or the terminal simply says, we're not taking any empties, So you can't pick up a full, Mr. or Ms. Dray person. All of that is an attempt. There's a charge for that. Another potential fee is called a stop-off, sometimes referred to as a chassis split or a chassis reposition. Those terms, again, it depends on the terminal, the port, practices of the trade. They can sometimes be used as synonymous terms. But this is a scenario where a drayman has to go to 2 different terminals to drop off or pick up a container. The chassis split fee is applicable to both ocean terminals and rail yards. Stop off, chassis split, reposition. It's a situation where a trucker doesn't just go into one terminal, drop off an empty, and pick up a full. And this has a lot to do with how many terminals are on a port, how many carriers call on terminals, whether the carrier has a vessel sharing agreement or is part of an alliance where containers can end up all over the place depending on whose ship a container is. This theme of stop-offs has become increasingly important in the age of alliances, in the age of superports with multiple terminals. Whenever a dray person has to go to 2 different terminals or 2 different start-stop points or 2 different anything to drop off or pick up a container, it's called a stop-off, chassis split, etc. There's going to be a fee for that because it's time-consuming at the end of the day. Let's look at a sample port drayage quote, admittedly and clearly anyway, related to drayage to and from the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. This is an actual quote that does a decent job of demonstrating what are some of the charges that we need to be aware of as BCOs. We'll note in our columns we have the service on the left, a description of that service, the rate, and what is really quite important is the unit of measure. How is that fee being built? We not only want to focus on what the services are in the description, but what is the unit of measure? Is it by container? Is it by hour? Things of this nature. Let's start off on the left with our base drayage, as it's called, the essential service of drayage, which includes the drop-off of an empty and the pickup of a full. In this instance, we're looking at base drayage from the port of LA or Long Beach to Carson, California. Just for geographical reference, Carson is a pretty big city, but on its best day, about 10 miles away, if not shorter, from the ports of LA, Long Beach, to give an idea of the distance. The rate we see moving to the right is $280 per container. We talked of examples previously of $300. That was just for ease of calculation. It can be higher, it can be less. Right now, $280 is a very competitive rate for base drayage. Moving down, however, the first one we see is fuel surcharge. We talked about this. It's a percentage, as we see, per container. Why is that cell empty? Because it depends on the price of diesel during a given period of time. Maybe it's 20%. Maybe it's 21%. But the percentage is going to be of the base drayage rate. We use the case of 300 at 20% fuel surcharge. That would make the drayage, including the base dray and the fuel, at 360. Chassis, at cost, plus $5 administration charge. This is from the drayage company, which would imply that in certain instances, this drayage provider doesn't have their own chassis. That's not unusual at all. They're going to be charged, they being the dray company, for use of the chassis, and then pass that charge on with a $5 administrative charge. Right now, Port of LA Long Beach, we said this a couple of times, $35. Look at our unit of measure per day. It's not $35 for as long as you want. It's $35 per day. No free time. Some other terminology, some of which we haven't used yet actually. A bobtail to and from the Port of LA Long Beach and Carson, that just means when a tractor is on the move, a drayage power unit is on the move and it doesn't have a container on the back. That's a bobtail. You could bobtail into a terminal, which means you're not dropping off an empty or a full export container and just picking up a full import container. In this instance, and it doesn't have to be this way, it was negotiated, there's no charge. Inland transportation, this again is an actual quote to an importer who is in close proximity to Carson, California, and in some instances uses its own tractors to move goods from a transload facility to an actual BCO facility. That's not relevant for our conversation here, but we left it in here to illustrate that it is actually a real quotation. Moving down, we see standard fees on the left, a night gate, or what used to be called pair pass, which was an additional fee for picking up containers during the day as opposed to nighttime. But a night gate, $80 per container. When we defined a night gate or a night pickup, we said that that fee was there, typically because you have to pay extra at nighttime. Pair pass, again, no longer in play. There's a pair pass fee actually now in place specific to LA Long Beach. Whether you pick up during the day or at night, you're going to get charged anyway. That's cost plus $35. Congestion fees is at cost plus 10%. Continuing on with the same quotation, what else do we have? Because we can quickly see this whole drayage thing turns into a laundry list. And whenever there's a laundry list, that spells potential trouble from a misunderstanding perspective, from an actual billing perspective. Let's look at some of these accessorials as we note on the left. A drayage dry run or an attempt, meaning, as we defined previously, trucker goes in to pick up a container. For whatever reason, that attempt fails. The dray person can't complete the service. They still expended fuel. They still expended time. There's a $100 charge per container for that. A stop-off, pre-pull, or a refusal. We talked about stop-offs and pre-pulls, refusals, similar to an attempt. That's $100 a container. A chassis split, where a drop-off of an empty and the pickup of a full is not as simple as having a chassis laying around, go on the terminal and drop off the empty and come back. Maybe a terminal doesn't accept certain chassis. Maybe there aren't any available. Anytime it's not a clear-cut operation in and out without having to stop anywhere along the way, it's called a chassis split. In this instance, $85. A chassis flip, where chassis have to be changed before going on to a terminal. That's cost plus 20%. That's on a per container basis. Wait time. We defined this, a certain amount of time, a certain window within which a reasonable operation, a reasonable drayage operation has to be conducted. As the importer, we have to define what that reasonable time frame is. Beyond that, the unit of measure is per hour, and for wait time, $75 an hour. In big ports, unfortunately, it's not unusual to have truckers wait outside of a gate, outside of a terminal, for 2 or 3 hours. The worst case scenario, from a cost perspective, is where we have base drayage, we have fuel surcharge, and then we see maybe an attempt or two gets thrown in, wait time when a container is finally picked up. The actual cost can be more than double what was quoted as the base service. That's why we were saying earlier that attention must be paid to drayage operations. And then finally, this is part of a pre-pull equipment yard storage, where a container might be left at a dray person's yard overnight as part of a pre-pull. That's $35 a day. Sometimes the dray people charge, sometimes they don't. In this case, they do. Let's wrap up this section with a supply chain perspective. Standard versus day rate fees for drayage. One last factor to consider on the subject of port drayage is the difference in fee structures between what is called a standard dray and a day rate. Based on the amount of time it takes to dray a container to an inland destination, the difference in fees can be substantial, and it's important for an importer to have a clear understanding of these charges. In the example we just looked at, the dray was from the ports of LA Long Beach to Carson, 5, maybe 10 miles on its best day. That's why the base rate was lower than one might see, $280. If that drayage had to go out to somewhere in the Inland Empire, which is 50, 60, 70 miles from LA Long Beach, the fee would have been higher, or, as we'll see in a moment, could be based on a day rate. Let's talk about that. Second paragraph. As the name indicates, a standard drayage service implies a drayman arranging for the pickup of a full container at a designated ocean terminal and transportation to a location typically less than 50 miles from the port. In the case of a drayage move from, say, Long Beach to Wilmington, which happens to be even closer to the port than Carson, less than 10 miles distance, the fee might be $300 plus a 22.5% fuel surcharge and $35 per day fee with no free time on that chassis. Those numbers are all consistent with virtually all of the examples we've provided thus far. Last paragraph. Conversely, day rates apply when the distance from the port ties up a driver and power unit for an entire day and no other turns, as they're called, can be achieved by that driver. A turn is basically the number of trips in and out of a port that a driver can make in a day. Obviously, drayage people want to do as many turns as possible because that's how they bill. As many dray operations as they run, as many terms as they run in a day, that's what they can bill. In the case of SoCal, where many DCs are located out in that inland empire that we mentioned a moment ago, easily more than 50 miles from Long Beach, both the distance and time lost in traffic, not to mention the fuel, would require that a day rate apply. That just means that probably that dray person that's going out to the Inland Empire, which is a multi-city region 50 plus miles from LA Long Beach, they're only going to be able to do one turn. As such, typically, last sentence, a day rate in Southern California would be applied, and that could very easily be $1,500 plus fuel. Where DCs, where BCO operations, where foreign trade zones are located matters when it comes to drayage. The further away that destination, the more expensive it's going to be. And if it gets really far away, defined as the trucker only being able to do one turn a day, the importer might be charged a day rate. The importer has to know that, agree to it, and understand what the fee is. That will wrap up our two-section conversation on drayage-related fees. Now we're going to move on to domestic on-forwarding in the realm of full truckload transportation. Longer haul stuff with a completely different pricing structure.